Hello, my name is Sean Butler, and welcome to these discussions on animal rights law with myself and my colleague, Dr. Raffael Fasel. So, Raffael, perhaps you could introduce yourself and say a little bit about how you got interested in animal rights law.
Sure. Hello, my name is Raffael Fasel. I'm a fellow in law at Jesus College in Cambridge, UK, and I also teach as an affiliated lecturer at the Cambridge Law Faculty. I became interested in animal rights law many years ago when I was an undergraduate student in law back home in Switzerland. And I was taking an introduction to the legal system class. And I still remember this was a sort of late evening class sitting in a big lecture theatre with a distinguished professor who had us sort of question the foundations of the legal system and foundational legal concepts. And one question he asked was, why is it the case that animals who are living, breathing, feeling creatures are considered property by the law, whereas corporations, artificially created entities, are considered legal persons that even have certain fundamental rights? So I thought that was a fascinating sort of situation, a perplexing situation, an odd one that I wanted to find out more about. And so eventually in 2015, I came to Cambridge, did my PhD on animal rights and human rights, and was able to study those questions in more depth. Earlier this year, in 2023, we also published a textbook because really animal rights law is a new field. And we felt that there needs to be a text that people can use to draw on, to learn more about this field. And so this is the book we published, Animal Rights Law. It came out in 2023, published by Hart Publishing. But perhaps, Sean, you'd like to introduce yourself too.
Thank you. So I'm a fellow of St Edmund's College at Cambridge, and I also lecture in the law faculty. I've been a fellow for some years. I've taught other legal subjects. I've taught intellectual property and also the law of ancient Rome. I got interested in animal rights law, I think, attending a class you organized, where you invited a guest lecturer to come along and talk about what animal rights might mean. I got fascinated, got intrigued, went away and did some reading, and then sent a note to Raphael and asked him if he'd like to teach with me, if he'd like to lecture the course with me. He agreed. I went to the law faculty, and they gave us a lecture room, and were pleased to support us. So we taught informally in Cambridge for about 4 or 5 years, and had a super group of students every year. And then 3 years ago, we got approval by the law faculty for the course to be part of the law degree. So it's now a final year law degree subject, so taken by a group of students who are just about to graduate, along other courses obviously available to them. And that's very pleasing and very exciting. And as you say, the textbook is a useful part of that.
Yes. So to start us off, Sean, can you talk to our viewers about the purpose of these discussions that we're having today?
Sure. So I think the main aim is just to increase awareness, give some understanding, some background to animal welfare laws, some background to the nature of animal rights and where animal rights are going, what sort of progress we're seeing. Because obviously animal welfare laws are the existing systems, but the potential for animal rights law is really quite intriguing and quite enormous. So, do you want to talk about the various discussions we're going to have?
Sure, yes. So we're going to be tackling animal rights law over 5 sections. We will start by talking about animal welfare law. What are the laws that are currently in place aiming to protect animals across the world? In a second discussion, we will consider an alternative to welfare, and that's animal rights. Third, we will probe that idea of animal rights. We will put it to the test by asking whether it makes theoretical sense to talk of animals as rights holders. Fourth, we will consider some of the progress that has already been made in courts and in legislatures around the world towards achieving animal rights laws. And then in a last discussion that I'm particularly sort of keen about, we are going to be discussing the future of animal rights law. So that should be an interesting one. These discussions are bite-sized, so you can watch them individually or you can watch them all in one go. It's really up to you. I hope you will enjoy them.
Thank you. So when we come back after the break, the next discussion will be on animal welfare laws. Thank you.
Let's start by talking about animal welfare law. Sean, what does animal welfare mean exactly?
So animal welfare is essentially a scientific description, and it refers to the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which they live and they die. So it's primarily scientific. Now, animal welfare laws, obviously, are designed to improve welfare, to give the animal good welfare. And there are animal welfare laws in many countries in the world, certainly not all, but many. Around about a third of the countries in the world have good animal welfare laws, Germany, for example, and many European Union countries. They regulate many aspects of an animal's life, improving the welfare. There are a number of other countries, about a third, that don't have animal welfare laws, but do have what are known as anti-cruelty laws. And you can imagine anti-cruelty means not being cruel to an animal. So there's a number of countries that have that. And then there's just under a third of countries that have no protection at all. There are no rules, regulations determining how someone should look after an animal. But let's focus on the good welfare, on the countries that have good animal welfare rules. These countries tend to follow a similar pattern, and that pattern is sometimes known as the 5 freedoms. Talk about them in a moment, but the 5 freedoms actually came from some work done in the UK in the 1960s. An author called Ruth Harrison wrote Animal Machines in about 1963, 64, and it produced an outcry, public outcry. And in response, the government set up a royal commission, to look at the circumstances, the situation of animals being kept in factory farms, called the Bramble Commission. What the Bramble Commission did was very interestingly reflective report, really trying to put farmed animals in farmed conditions, to make us much more aware of their nature, their sentience. And the report itself talks about how they're not identical to humans, but neither are they so very different. And that was its starting point. So the 5 freedoms followed on from the Bramble Commission. As I say, it's been adopted widely in legislation around the world. So the 5 freedoms. First of all, hunger, freedom from hunger. So imagine a cow living on a farm. That cow is entitled to proper food, proper nutrition, a good balanced diet, regular access to water and so on. So freedom from hunger. Secondly, freedom from discomfort. So again, the cow should have a comfortable environment, have a barn or sheds or whatever, so that it's able to live reasonably well. So freedom from discomfort. Thirdly, freedom from pain and injury. If our cow gets ill, she's going to get veterinary attention. If she needs medicines and so on, she'll get those. So she's promptly treated and properly looked after. Fourthly, the freedom to express yourself. Our cow on the farm should have a freedom to enjoy, move around, explore, have an interesting environment, and of course have associations, meet other cows, meet other animals, other species. So that's the fourth one. And then finally, the freedom from fear and distress. So more straightforwardly, yes, our cow shouldn't be put in a situation where she's scared or terrified or worried. So those are the 5 freedoms. So hunger, discomfort, pain and injury, the freedom to express natural behavior, and freedom from fear and distress.
I mean, it sounds quite positive, at least, in the countries that have animal welfare laws. But we know that animal welfare law is also being criticized. So what's wrong with animal welfare?
There are some problems. I wouldn't like to undermine the good work that animal welfare laws have done. And they certainly altered our understanding of how we should deal with animals, how we should look after them. But there are some problems. One of them is simply the gap between the laws and the enforcement. And although there's limited evidence, there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that animal welfare laws are not as fully enforced as they might be. Local authorities, state authorities don't necessarily have the resources to deal with animal welfare breaches. Sometimes there's concerns about not wanting to get involved. There have been wider concerns. For example, the European Union published a report a few years ago saying that the very way in which animal welfare laws were drafted made it very difficult to enforce them. So very general laws, very general words were used in the laws. General laws about the 5 freedoms, the law of to ensure that they have a good environment. A good environment is very difficult to enforce legally and to bring prosecutions. So there's a problem with enforcement. There's also a problem that animal welfare laws, even though they may sound very general, very broad, sometimes simply don't include certain animals or certain species. So the US Animal Welfare Act, for example, excludes poultry and livestock. Now, as you can imagine, poultry and livestock make up the bulk of farmed animals, and yet these are excluded. So that's quite a big gap. Another example from the EU is that there are regulations on farmed animals and how they should be cared for, but it only covers vertebrates. So it doesn't include invertebrates. So, of course, the octopus is excluded. It's not included in the regulations. Now, that's sort of troubling in itself. Particularly, many people will have watched My Octopus Teacher and so have a sense of affinity with the octopus, their nature, their preferences, their sentience. And even more troubling is that it appears that there's going to be an octopus farm set up in southern Europe. And so the idea that the principles of factory farming could come into conflict with the basic needs and preferences of octopuses. Another area that's an issue is really to do with the improvement of animal welfare laws, the development law reform. And the difficulty there is that, to some extent, animal welfare law reform can be a political football. Political in the sense that animal welfare improvements increase the cost of keeping an animal, therefore it increases the cost of food. And so, particularly at the moment, there's concern by many, many countries about increasing food prices. So the idea that if you want to increase welfare laws, that's just going to add to the pressure on food prices is a difficulty. And we've seen it in the EU, some proposed reforms on the killing of one-day-old chicks are going to be deferred because of the cost. So there's some examples of issues or problems in relation to the animal welfare themselves. There is another problem, which is really the subject of these discussions, and that is that the paradigm of animal welfare laws is the existing system, what we do now. So animal welfare laws talk about how we keep an animal in a factory farm. It talks about how we deal with an animal at the time of slaughter. It doesn't question whether we should be having an animal in a factory farm, whether we should be slaughtering that animal for food. So it's a different sort of issue, but it's still a very genuine one.
Okay, thank you for that, Sean. In our next discussion, we will explore an alternative to animal welfare, and that's animal rights.
So we've seen some of the limitations of animal welfare laws, and now what we're going to look at in this discussion are the possibilities of an alternative animal rights law. So Raphael, perhaps you could define that for us.
Sure, yeah. The idea behind animal rights law is quite a simple one. Animal rights is about protecting the fundamental interests of animals. And I think our viewers will already be familiar with that idea from the human rights context, because really animal rights is modeled on the concept of human rights. Constitutional rights that we have, or even international human rights documents. If you're thinking, for instance, of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the European Convention on Human Rights, these are instruments that protect humans' fundamental interests in speech, for instance, or exercising their religion, or indeed in not being tortured. Animal rights is trying to do the same thing, but for animals. And you'll notice, of course, now that this is quite a different story, a different paradigm than animal welfare law. Because animal welfare law accepts that we can use and kill animals. It's just saying that we need to regulate how we use animals and how we kill animals, but we can still go ahead and do it. Animal rights, by saying that animals have certain fundamental interests, questions this. It questions the killing of animals, and it questions certain uses of animals. So it's quite a different story.
So can you give us some specific examples?
Sure, yeah, I'll give you 2 examples. Let's start with the right to liberty, or the right to be free. Consider, for instance, the case of Happy. Who's Happy? Happy is an elephant who lives in the Bronx Zoo in New York in the US. Happy used to have a companion called Grumpy, but Grumpy died some time ago. So Happy is now all on her own in that enclosure in the Bronx Zoo. And that enclosure is really much too small for elephant standards. And what happened in this case was an organization called the Non-Human Rights Project brought a case on behalf of Happy in 2018. And they went to a court in New York and tried to argue that animals like Happy should have a right to liberty and should be freed from the zoo and be moved to a sanctuary. The court didn't agree with the Non-Human Rights Project in this case, but it's a nice example to illustrate the kind of right we're talking about, right to liberty in this case. But let me give you another example, the right to life and to integrity. This right came up in 2016 in Switzerland, where in the state of Basel City, a group of citizens came together and said, we want to change our constitution with a ballot initiative. And in particular, we want to add to the existing Bill of Rights in the Constitution, which protects humans' right to life, humans' right to bodily and mental integrity and other rights. We want to add to that non-human primates' right to life and non-human primates' right to bodily and mental integrity. The initiative was turned down at the ballot box by the citizenry of the state. But again, it's an interesting example of what kinds of rights we're talking about when we discuss animal rights. Now, the fact that these both were turned down, I think, shows more broadly the ramifications here. Animals are still suffering to quite some degree, and they're not being protected by fundamental rights. But there's some progress that we're seeing, and we're going to be talking about this later on.
Okay, so I can understand they're quite clear rights, the idea of liberty, the idea of bodily integrity. But there's discussion about what actually qualifies as an animal right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So some people think that animal welfare laws that currently exist, as we were talking about, they give animals rights. But others disagree with that position, and they say, no, these animal protection laws, they don't give animals rights. Rights is something different. To make sense of this disagreement, in the textbook, we distinguish between thin rights on the one hand and thick rights on the other. We say that the protections that animals have under current animal protection laws, animal welfare laws, give animals thin rights. So say if a human has a duty not to impose unnecessary suffering on an animal, then the animal can be said to have a thin right not to have unnecessary suffering imposed on them. But thick rights, which I think is what animal rights law is really about, tell a different story. They are the rights that are more akin to the human rights that I mentioned earlier. And really there's 3 features that characterize a thick right. The first feature is that a thick right is about protecting an animal's interest in a comprehensive way and not just a narrow way. Take the example of chickens, for instance. In most jurisdictions, or many jurisdictions at least, chickens have a thin right, if you like, not to be slaughtered if they're not stunned before the killing happens, right? So you need to anesthetize the chickens. There's some exceptions to this, but let's not go into those for now. Do these protections, these thin rights, give the chickens a proper protection for their interest in life? Not really. They protect the interest in life in a very narrow way, in that the chickens are not allowed to be slaughtered without being stunned before the slaughtering. But apart from that, you can still go ahead and do with the chickens whatever you want, as long as you respect that particular rule. Thick rights would tell a different story, and they would protect the chickens' right to life, if they had one, in a much more encompassing way, as we're used to it, in fact, in the human case with the right to life. So that's one feature. The second one has to do with the trade-offs that are currently allowed with thin rights that would no longer be allowed with thick rights. Thick rights have a very high threshold. If you have a trivial interest as a human in using or killing an animal, that's no longer sufficient for overriding the animal's interest and the animal's right. Take again our chickens. If chickens had a right to life, then a trivial or arguably trivial human interest in eating chickens because they taste good, then that would no longer suffice to override the chicken's interest in being alive, because that's the more vital, more important interest. So that's the second feature. And then the third feature has to do with the enforceability, an issue you already raised earlier on when talking about welfare laws. And you've told us that, animal welfare agencies that are tasked with enforcing animal welfare laws are usually underfunded, understaffed. They have industry influence coming in, sort of shaping the enforcement or lack thereof, indeed. Thick rights would grant legal standing to animals, or indeed their guardians. So animals would be provided with legal attorneys or legal guardians that can bring lawsuits if their rights are violated. So these then are the three features that make up a thick right. The fact that they protect animals' interests in a comprehensive way, the fact that a thick right cannot be traded off easily against trivial human interests, and the fact that it gives animals legal standing.
Raphael, thank you. That brings us to the end of this discussion. And next time, we're going to be looking at some of the theories behind animal rights law. We're now going to look at some of the legal issues behind animal rights law. Raphael, can I start by asking you, can animals have legal rights?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And a lot of animal rights scholars and theorists have been working on what it would mean for animals to have rights. And I think it's tempting to think that, that's just an ivory tower exercise. It's got no relevance for animals because, what we should be doing is, trying to achieve change on the ground, direct action, and all of that is very important. But I think it's also important to make sure that the concepts we use, the theoretical tools that we employ, are as sharp as they can be. I think there's then a big role for scholarship, and we dedicate an entire chapter actually to the legal theory of animal rights.
So what are some of the main issues?
There's a lot of open questions, but let me talk you through two of the main issues. The first one has got to do with the relationship between legal personhood and rights. Specifically, the question that people are discussing is, do you need to be a legal person to have rights? In other words, for animals to become rights holders, do they need to overcome their property status and be turned into legal persons? Or is that not, in fact, a necessary condition? Let's consider a case, the case of Tommy, the chimpanzee. Tommy is kept in a cage somewhere in upstate New York. He's being kept there by a private individual who keeps Tommy there in a trailer, really. In 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project, the organization we came across earlier when talking about Happy, they brought one of these habeas corpus petitions on behalf of Tommy. So arguing that a court should recognize Tommy as a legal person with the right to bodily liberty and therefore be moved from that cage to a sanctuary. The court in the case decided against the Non-Human Rights Project, and it argued that legal personhood is necessary for rights, such as the right to liberty. And because Tommy is not a human being, Tommy cannot be a legal person, therefore cannot have that right to liberty, therefore cannot be moved from the cage to the sanctuary. The court here followed the orthodox view on legal personhood, which says, yes, you have to be a legal person to have rights. That view is also defended by some scholars. Gary Francione, for instance, a scholar at Rutgers Law School in New Jersey, argues that for animals to have rights, they need to cease to be property and be turned into legal persons. But there's people who disagree with him. In recent scholarship, we're seeing folks such as Alistair Cochrane, who's a political theorist at the University of Sheffield in the UK, or Visa Kurki, a legal scholar at the University of Helsinki in Finland. They challenge this notion that you need to be a legal person to have rights. And they say animals already have rights. Look at all the animal protection laws that are out there. They give animals rights, specifically the thin rights that we were talking about earlier. So in the view of those scholars, legal personhood is a bit of a red herring. What we should be concerned about is not whether animals need to be legal persons. They don't. They already have certain rights. But rather the question becomes, which kinds of rights should they have? And perhaps if the court in the Tommy case had adopted this new perspective, Tommy might now be in a sanctuary rather than still be in his cage.
Interesting thought. You said there were two issues. What's the second one?
The second one's got to do with the question whether to have rights, you also need to have duties. So are rights and duties in a relationship of reciprocity, if you like? Take again the Tommy case. The reason why the court thought that Tommy cannot have the right to liberty was that it said that to have rights of any sort, you have to be able to fulfill social obligations, to reciprocate duties. And the court claimed that Tommy, a chimpanzee, cannot do that because he's not a human being. And because rights and duties are in this relationship of reciprocity, Tommy cannot have the right to liberty and therefore is still in his cage. But again, there's other ways of looking at this question. And there's really two problems that stand out with the court's reasoning here. The first one is, if reciprocity is a necessary condition for rights holding, then there's some human beings who don't fulfill that criterion. And that's a problem. Think, for instance, of human infants or people in a coma who aren't able, at least in that moment, to fulfill their social obligations. But still, they have rights. Right to life, right to integrity, for good reason. We don't want to take away these rights, but the reciprocity criterion would have us do that. So it's a problematic criterion to use for rights holding. But even if we assume that it wasn't a problematic criterion, there's a second problem. The court didn't consider that non-human species can potentially also reciprocate duties. Tommy is a chimpanzee. Chimpanzees are famously social animals. A recent study, for instance, found that chimpanzees not only produce their own medicines, but they apply to others to heal others' wounds. So they do very much reciprocate social obligations. So arguably, they would deserve certain rights under that position. So again, it very much matters which view we take on such theoretical questions. And had the court taken a different view, then maybe Tommy would be in a sanctuary now.
So you talked about barriers for animals to have rights. What about justifications?
It's an interesting question, and I have to generalize a bit here because different people take different approaches. But broadly, what most animal rights lawyers agree on is that we should be looking at the interests that individual animals have or their needs. And if we find that they have needs or interests that are sufficiently important, then we should give them rights to protect those interests or needs. Consider the theory of Martha Nussbaum, for instance. Nussbaum is a political philosopher working at the University of Chicago in the US. And she puts forward what she calls the capabilities approach. Nussbaum argues that all animals have a range of different capabilities, needs and abilities, if you like, that need to be fulfilled, at least to a minimum degree, so that these animals can have what she calls a flourishing life, a life of dignity. And importantly, different species will have different ways of flourishing. Take, for instance, sheep. Sheep are a gregarious species. Sheep flourish if they live in flocks. But there's other animals that won't flourish if they live in groups of their conspecifics. Jaguars, for instance. Jaguars are very different from sheep in that jaguars are a solitary species. They only come together for courting and mating purposes. So for them to flourish is not to live in a pack of other jaguars. They will need other things, such as, not to be hunted down for their fur. So it very much matters what species you belong to as far as, what capabilities you have.
So what sort of capabilities does Nussbaum talk about in terms of flourishing?
So she gives us a whole list, but here's some important ones. So some we've already talked about: life, bodily health, but there's some other capabilities and indeed entitlements that she thinks different animals have. One is living with other animals. In the sheep context that we looked at earlier, we saw that, some sheep may have an interest in living with other sheep, but she thinks there's animals that also have an interest in living with members of other species. Think, for instance, of companion animals, cats, dogs, other companion animals. Arguably, they flourish when they're with humans and maybe members of other species still. She gives us other examples too. Play, this almost instinctive drive that animals have to explore their boundaries. We should have an entitlement to that, she argues. All animals should. And then another, perhaps last interesting one for us is having control over one's own environment. You can take that in a literal, direct sense. Think, for instance, of a beaver creating a dam and reshaping entire landscapes. But also you can look at it in a more indirect sense, and she thinks that's covered too. For instance, the kinds of spaces that animals live in. Take cities. Cities are very much designed by and for humans. They don't really take into account the needs of other animals that live here, for instance, companion animals. So that capability in the case of maybe dogs would mean dogs should be allowed on public transport. Dogs should be allowed in public buildings. So again, here's another way of thinking about the capability and how we will give an animal an entitlement to shape their space.
Raphael, thank you. In our next discussion, we're going to look at the progress being made towards animals actually being granted rights.
We saw in our last conversation that animal rights law is still, to some degree, a theoretical proposal, but we are seeing some progress on the ground. Sean, what's happening in the courts?
Well, as you've mentioned in previous discussions, there have been some cases that have been unsuccessful. So we are aware that the track record is not ideal. However, I want to focus on a couple of more recent cases that have been very positive about animal rights law and lead us in some very interesting, very worthwhile directions. So I'm going to talk about two. Carvan, who is an elephant, and Estrelita, a woolly monkey. So let's start with Carvan. He was in the Islamabad Zoo in Pakistan, and the conditions there were not good. So an action was brought for him to be freed, to be released from the zoo to a sanctuary. And the basis of the action was that he had rights and therefore was entitled to be moved to a better life. The court agreed. The judge, Judge Manala, said, yes, animals should have rights. He gave a very interesting, reflective judgment, and he drew on quite a few sources. He drew on religious sources, the respect of many religions for life. He drew on the idea that animals have natural rights and that really should have rights. He drew on the environmental aspects, the relationship with nature. And he also drew on the notion that how we treat animals reflects and has a link with humans and the human future. So he did all those things. But overall, I think he was very keen to see Carvan, in fact, the other animals in the zoo, moved somewhere better to have a better life. I'd just like to quote from Judge Manala's judgment. He said, "It's a right of each animal, a living being, to live in an environment that meets the latter's behavioral, social, and physiological needs." Now that's a bold, clear, straightforward statement. And of course also harks back to the 5 freedoms, the idea of the right to express themselves. Really nice case, very straightforward, and I think a very important one. The second case, Estrelita. So Estrelita, a woolly monkey living in Ecuador. Now, Estrelita was a wild animal, was caught in the wild when she was about a month old, and lived with a family in a family home for almost all her life, about 18 years. Obviously, she was a wild animal, and when the authorities learned about it, they went to the home and they took Estrelita away. The owner was very distraught and brought an action for habeas corpus, for release or consideration of her condition. Unfortunately, while Estrelita was being kept, held in the local zoo, after about a month, she died of cardiac arrest. The court, however, they decided it was such an important matter, they wanted to hear the case. Now, unlike Carvan, the court relied on the Constitution of Ecuador. And the Constitution of Ecuador protects the rights of nature. It recognizes that nature has rights. But the court went further, because what they said was, well, nature has rights, and that means that individuals that make up nature have rights. So the very individual animals have rights. Therefore, Estrelita and other wild animals have rights. Again, let me quote a little bit from Estrelita. They said that wild animals have the right to the free development of their animal behavior. So the right to their free development, not allowing it. They said wild animals have the right not to be hunted, fished, captured, collected, extracted, kept, retained, trafficked, traded, or exchanged. So a wonderfully long list that lawyers are wont to do, but covering all aspects of a wild animal's life. And the court said this was a right. Estrelita and other wild animals were the subjects of rights. And that's fascinating.
These are certainly fascinating cases. They're positive cases where courts have granted rights to animals. But in previous discussions, we looked at some of the negative cases too, where courts have shied away from doing that. What are their concerns?
I think there are 2 concerns that I sense in the courts. The first is a genuine discomfort. They genuinely feel that the shift, the fundamental paradigm shift that we talked about before, that would follow from recognizing rights for animals, is simply too great for them. It's asking too much of them. And although they're not expressly saying they feel uncomfortable, it may be the source of some of the sort of points you've mentioned in earlier discussions, the sort of concerns mentioned by the courts. So that's the first one. The second reason that the courts have shied away, I think, is that they genuinely feel this is not a job for courts. This is a job for legislation. This is a job for lawmaking, for changing the law and expressively and actively granting rights to animals, rather than finding it within legislation that was probably never intended for it. Now, interestingly, there was a case a few years ago where the law referred to persons, and the court examined what persons meant, and after looking at precedent and so on, came to the clear view that persons meant human persons. But they then went on to say, if, however, the law was changed and expressly made that persons includes humans and non-human persons, they were perfectly happy to implement it. So it's not a fundamental problem. It's more that they feel it's not a job for them.
You're hinting at something important here, Sean, namely the fact that courts are one important forum for legal change, but legislatures are another forum. So are we seeing any progress there?
Absolutely. And I think law reform through that route is going to be terribly significant. Now, having said that, a few months ago, I would have given a somewhat different answer. I would have said there's some very interesting work being done. The Finnish Animal Rights Lawyers Society, for example, have produced an excellent document designed to fit into the Finnish constitution. Very well crafted, very well designed, and fully explained, granting rights to sentient animals. Similarly, things like the Great Apes Project, rights for great apes, Cetacean Project, rights for whales, and so on. These, however, were all drafts. They're proposals, and while valuable and interesting, they are just proposals. A few months ago, the country of Panama changed its law, introduced a new law to protect turtles. And what is unusual, interesting about this is they haven't just done it through welfare laws, they've done it through rights. And their new law specifically says turtles will have rights. I'd like to read to you from the law. The law of Panama then will protect the rights of sea turtles and their habitats, such as living and having free passage in a healthy environment, free from anthropocentric impacts such as bycatch. So now they're specifically referring to rights, and they're specifically referring to the freedom of turtles to have free passage, right to live, right to life, the right to a healthy environment. Now, we're not sure how the law will be developed, so who's going to enforce it and so on, but it's a very interesting law.
It's certainly really exciting to hear about this progress we're seeing in the courts and legislatures. In our next and last talk, we will look at what the future of animal rights law holds. In our last discussion, we talked about cases that recognized animals as rights holders, and we also considered some of the political initiatives to change legislation and constitutions. Sean, in your view, what does the future hold for animal rights law?
Well, the cases and the law we looked at last time, I think, are all very promising in terms of other countries and other courts following them. Estrelita, rights of nature, we could see other countries adopting that concept. Carvan, a straightforward granting rights to animals, very plain, very clear recognition. And the law passed in Panama, protecting the rights of turtles. That's something which I could very much see other countries adopting, particularly where they want to protect wildlife, particularly ocean-based wildlife. So all three, I think, have very good leads, set very good directions for others to follow.
On the topic of wildlife, you mentioned Estrelita a few times. Obviously, it's a case that has made international headlines. Do you see this as a way forward, connecting rights of nature to animal rights?
In a strict sense, no, alas, because Estrelita, you remember, was based not just on rights of nature, but on a constitutional protection of nature. And only very few countries protect nature in their constitutions. So in a very strict sense, I don't think it can be adopted. However, I think more broadly, the idea of linking nature, the environment, climate change and so on, to human behavior and how we treat animals, that I see as a very much more promising route. And in a way, Carvan drew on some of those ideas. Jeff Sebo, for example, talks about saving animals, saving people as a sort of cry for animal rights lawyers, linking the two together. Saskia Stuckey suggests that we really can't try and tackle climate change without also addressing the animal welfare issues and how we treat animals. So I think there's a broader movement where we are going to be seeing animal rights laws, but justified not only because of the entitlement or the rights of animals to flourish, but also for other reasons, ourselves, our environment, and so on. Raphael, let me ask you in turn, there have been a line of cases, some of which you've talked about, where habeas corpus has been brought. Do you think animal rights lawyers are going to continue with habeas corpus or not?
I think they are. And yes, it's true. A lot of these cases weren't successful. especially if you're thinking of, the United States and the cases that the Non-Human Rights Project, has been bringing. But we need to see the bigger picture here. What organizations like the Non-Human Rights Project are doing is really historic. And if we draw the comparison with other historic litigation efforts, we can see that things just take a long time. Think, for instance, of efforts to get formerly enslaved people recognized as legal persons. It took countless habeas corpus petitions to achieve that. In fact, the whole effort to get formerly enslaved people to be recognized as full rights holders has not only taken hundreds of years, you might say it's still ongoing if you're thinking of the context of systemic injustice that we're still dealing with. Animal rights, too, I think, is about this idea of the constant dripping that will wear away the stone. And we have seen important, significant changes lately. In the Happy case that we talked about previously, there was a really powerful, two powerful dissenting opinions by judges who didn't agree that Happy should stay in the zoo, who felt very clearly that Happy should be moved to a sanctuary, be recognized as a legal person, as a rights holder. And there's one case we didn't even talk about, the Cecilia case from 2016. Cecilia was a chimpanzee living in a zoo in Argentina, and a judge decided that Cecilia is a legal person with the right to liberty and moved her to a sanctuary. So progress is slow, but it is constant, and we're going to be seeing more and more of it. Now, Sean, I know you've thought about the question of how long it might take for animal rights to become a reality. Can you share that with our viewers?
50 years. I think it'll take 50 years, give or take a year. And I think it's going to take generational change, a generational change in attitudes towards food, meat, killing animals, and so on. And we've already seen, it's already started. We've seen shifts from vegetarianism, veganism, and so on. So I think all of those trends will continue, but it'll take that sort of amount of time for such a fundamental shift. Let me ask you the same question. How long do you think it's going to take for animal rights to be realized? And how do you think we'll get there?
I'm personally slightly more hesitant to make a precise prediction, but what I do think I can say confidently is that progress will be gradual. We're going to be seeing over the next years, decades, more rights being granted to animals. I think we're going to move away from just, right to liberty, right to life. Potentially, we're going to be seeing something like the right to family life at some point. Secondly, I think more animals are going to become rights holders. We talked a lot about elephants and chimpanzees, and those are important animals, but we call them elite species in the textbook. They are easy targets for rights. I think at some point, potentially, you might see farmed animals as well being granted certain rights. Think of the chickens, for instance, that we discussed. Maybe they're going to get their right to life at some point. And then lastly, I think we're going to be seeing an extension as far as geography is concerned. I think in North America, there's going to soon be a case that will be successful. But potentially we're going to be seeing cases being brought or legislation being brought in Africa as well, in other parts of Asia. And I think more generally, if we were to give a piece of advice to animal rights advocates, I think it would be that they need to pursue a multi-pronged strategy. There's really no silver bullet here. They will need to keep bringing litigation in the courts. They will also need to keep drafting bills of rights, proposals for lawmakers. They need to work on changing public opinion to get public opinion even more on their side. And lastly, there's education too, which plays a significant role. And really, that's where the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law comes in, that we founded in 2019. And our centre has a range of different activities for people interested in animal rights law. We do events, we do workshops, conferences, we have talk series, lots of material on our website. So I would very much encourage our viewers to check out the website. That's animalrightslaw.org if you're interested in finding out more about this fascinating new topic that is animal rights law. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these discussions.
Yes, thank you for watching. And in case you're wondering how such a huge change should come about and how society and society's values could change so much, I'd like to leave you with a quote by the economist John Stuart Mill. And he said, "It often happens that the universal belief of one age becomes to a subsequent age so palpable an absurdity that the only difficulty then is to imagine how such a thing can ever have appeared credible." Thank you. For Animal Law Fundamentals, I'm Sean Butler.
And I'm Raffael Fasel.